I gotta say, Genesis 18 has, for whatever reason, become such a pivotal chapter for my own faith. I go back to it again and again, and it's really shaped how I understand the nature of faith and our relationship with God and what God's calling us to be a part of. So I'm really excited to dive in with you right now. Genesis 18, 16 through 25. The men got up from there and went over to look down on Sodom. Abraham was walking along with them to send them off when the Lord said, "Will I keep from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will certainly become a great populous nation, and all the earth's nations will be blessed because of him. I have formed a relationship with him so that he will instruct his children and his household after him. And they will keep to the Lord's path, being moral and just, so that the Lord can do for Abraham everything he said he would." Then the Lord said, "The cries of injustice from Sodom and Gomorrah are countless, and their sin is very serious. I will go down now to examine the cries of injustice that have reached me. Have they really done all this? If not, I want to know." The men turned away and walked toward Sodom. But Abraham remained standing in front of the Lord. Abraham approached and said, "Will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty? What if there are 50 innocent people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not save the place for the sake of the 50 innocent people in it? It is not like you to do this, killing the innocent with the guilty as if there were no difference. It is not like you. Will the judge of all the earth not act justly?" This passage, in so many ways, has shaped my own understanding of what faith looks like, of what God actually invites us into as his children, and even a deeper dive into who God is and his character. And so there's one on God's character here. This is a God of mercy who does not want to act flippantly, out of character, and he paints this picture where I've heard the cries of their sin and injustice have come up to me, but I'm gonna make extra sure. I'm gonna go down, and he's sending his angels, his destroyers, to go right down into the ground level to examine it. Have they really done this? If not, I want to know. It's this picture of a God who does his due diligence to say, my judgment is not going to be flippant or undeserved. So that's a really great, interesting view of God's mercy, of how he's making extra sure that what's happening is actually happening. But here, this is fascinating, the way that God describes Abraham. He says, well, I've made him to be a great nation and to do justice and to bring justice to the world, to be upright and moral. And really the picture that I get as I look at this description here, and why is God even telling Abraham what he's about to do? What is going on here? That the image is maybe of like a cabinet, right? Like a president's cabinet, or the divine council. To say you have this king of all the earth, but he's actually inviting this human, Abraham, to be a part of his divine council. God is still the king. He's still the one that's going to make all the ultimate decisions. He's the one with all the power, with all the authority, but he's inviting this mere mortal, this Abraham, to be a part of his divine council, to push back. A famous modern-day rabbi was describing what faith looks like. For the Jewish people, a lot because of this passage here, faith is faith as protest. You see that through the Psalms, through the laments. Faith is a protest, to say our job to be the most faithful follower of God we can be is when it looks like there's injustice in the world, we're supposed to protest right before our king. And so for Abraham to stand before God and say, God, this is not like you. You're acting out of character, God. I mean, that's the sort of accusation a lot of us as Christians would think, I'm never allowed to tell God that. Are you really just, God? Will the judge of the earth not act justly? Abraham is entering into this faith as protest, where maybe sometimes this is a overly simplistic definition, but sometimes in the church, we think of faith as like, I don't know, blind obedience, right? We just accept God's will and blindly follow him, trusting him no matter what. But this passage kind of flips that on its head and says, actually, to be the most faithful person Abraham could be in this moment was actually to stand up to God and protest and say, Lord, this doesn't seem like it's just. Are you sure this is within character? Are you supposed to do this? And we see this faith as protest popping up in the prophets, in the story of Moses, when God's about to wipe out all of Israel for their sin with the golden calf. Moses stands in the gap and says, Lord, don't do this. I protest. And so anyway, thinking about that, what does this image of faith as protest tell us? And as God's children, he invites us in a lot of ways into his divine counsel. Again, he's still the king. He's the one with authority, with power, and ultimately he's the only one that can act. But he actually invites Abraham in and says, what do you have to say about this, Abraham? I want to know your opinion because I've created you to be a blessing for the world, to bring justice to the world. And so Abraham stands in the gap and argues with God, protests for a little bit. Maybe that's a whole new idea for us this week, but maybe reflecting on this image here, we're going to look at it again next week. What would it look like for us to embody faith as protest and not mere blind obedience? Well, I'll be honest, I kind of hope that this week's Bible study gets under your skin just a little bit. This idea that faith is faith as protest, that we are invited in to actually argue with God sometimes, is unsettling. But it's really shaped as how I see the rest of Scripture. It happens all over the place. God consistently invites his people to stand in the gap, to yell, to bear all their emotions. One way this week, if this is something that you want to dive into, to explore this aspect of our faith, of our life of prayer with God, read through the Psalms. Most of those Psalms are what we would call laments or protest Psalms, and find some that really bear their emotions. Psalm 13, 22, 44, 88, those are just a few that you could dive into that kind of would help shape your own prayer life, to say, how can I take the issues, the problems, the pain that is happening in my own life, that I see in my communities around me, and actually bring that to God and say, God, this doesn't seem fair. What are you going to do about it? And actually join God's divine counsel. Try that this week. Dive in and let's start a conversation, because this is just scratching the surface of this whole big topic of what faith in the Bible really looks like.